Sure. Okay. Okay. Should be able to see my PDF.
Yeah. Am
Yeah.
I host already or
You should be, yes.
okay? But I
Thank
have
you.
just button leave with not end the session.
PDF.
So
Yeah.
am I host already or
You should be, yes.
okay?
Thank you.
But I have just button leave with not end the session. No. Hello. Hello, everybody.
Yeah.
So let's start. Welcome to Monday Morning Neuroccino. Here we are presenting exciting papers that we find and we share it with each other in a very casual manner. So today, Eduardo will present the paper that he already has already shared the link and shared his screen. So take it away and start.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Lilith. So I picked this paper for a couple of reasons. First one is a kind of follow-up to a Neuroccino that Anna did a while ago, a couple of years ago, probably. Because some of these authors, especially the first one, Mathis, is also the same author as the Zebra model, which was an encoding decoding model that was proposed a couple of years ago, 2023, by this group in Switzerland. And yeah, the second reason is that I thought it might have been an interesting paper because reading the abstract, they were mentioning this possibly new approach, the mechanistic approach to the brain. I have to admit the development of the paper is not as satisfying as I thought from the abstract, but it's still a nice paper. So I'll try to summarize it a little bit for you, and maybe we can discuss it. There are not even that many pictures, so we'll see. But yeah, anyway, so the title is Decoding the Brain from Neural Representations to Mechanistic Models. They do speak a lot about decoding and neural representations. We'll see about the mechanistic models. So they start from. So their idea is to outline a conceptual framework in which the brain should be thought as a computational device, of course, that encode and decode information. And what I thought it was interesting is that they mentioned that it should do this by balancing local specialization of different areas and distributed circuitry, so sharing information across the brains, using this kind of distributed networks to continually encode information and transform it into behavior and cognition. Um, this is basically also what the introduction of the paper. They describe how these encoding, decoding of sensory information should guide action and cognition. The brain should be again a computational device where the neural circuits continuously transform the information, and of course, understanding how this information is encoding is a central goal of neuroscience. They also introduced the definition of decoding and encoding. They don't give a proper definition, so it was a little bit hard at first, because what you usually have when we speak about like encoding and decoding models of brain activity is more or less what you see in the first panel A of this image, where you have encoding models that try to predict the neural signal based on the some kind of stimuli that you consider relevant. But the point is you go from the stimulus to the neural activity, and the decoding models, they do the other way around. So you have the brain activity and you try to reconstruct the stimulus that was presented, say, to your participant, to animals, whatever. But then they also seems to use across the paper like a more flexible definition of decoding and encoding. For example, they speak about decoding as how the brain interprets kind of like a lower-ish level sensory information and task-related information. So, for example, there will be the processing that occurs in, say, the primary sensory cortices, but also like a little bit higher level cortices, say like a V4 or V5 for visual stimuli. And then they talk about encoding. Sorry, this was the encoding, and then they talk about the decoding as what the brains do afterwards to kind of produce an output. So more like still inside the brain, but more toward the end of the process of generating behavior. And then they try to go a little bit more in detail in explaining this, like how to deal with neural encoding. So this again, neurons encode sensory stimuli through action potentials eventually, and by like electrochemical signaling. And we can analyze this kind of data. We can use linear regression, generalized linear models, artificial neural networks, whatever works. But at the very end, all the encoding models, as they say, they try to, let's see if they, yeah, I mean, they summarize it in this little teeny tiny equation. Um, all the encoding models attempt to predict neural responses based on an external stimulus, right? So this should help us to understand how the information is processed inside the brain. And of course, since the encoding comes before the decoding, understanding the encoding part would also provide a foundation to decode, to understand decoding, the decoding part that the brain is doing, um, which yeah, it's fundamental if you want to build, for example, say brain-computer interfaces. So they move on and they speak about the decoding within the brain and the neural decoding mathematical principles. Here is part where like yeah things get a little bit hairy. Um, they in this section they speak about decoding as something involving um, the extraction of meaningful information from neural activity that has been already partially processed. Essentially like reversing the encoding process to generate an output. So for example, say in the visual, they brought an example. They say like, for example, in the visual system, you have like early sensory areas that are encoding like low-level features like edges and colors and movement, while higher level areas are extracting complex representations such as the object identity. Say you're looking at a mug, you extract that it's a mug. You're not caring about edges, shadows, whatever. And the yeah again the idea they put forward this idea that understanding the decoding part should help us understand how the brain actually works and allow us to build like applications for brain-computer interface and patients and stuff. But of course, how do we understand this decoding? This is what they put forward a few mathematical principles. They speak about like models that you can use. I don't know if I would call it like mathematical principles, like first principles. Because yeah, they put forward like a set of examples. They say you can use linear models, Bayesian inference, K-9 clustering, population vectors to combine neural signals to estimate like how external variables guide the firing of neurons or the brain activity more in general. Um, and they provide an example of this in so like this figure 2, where you can see like different. So you have the encoding part, which is the neuron firing based on the wind direction in the cricket. Um, antenna. And then they provide this example for like decoding population vector decoding approach, KNN approach, and a Bayesian decoder that basically is giving you the same results. You can decode where the wind is coming from based on the input of the neurons. But of course, this is a relatively say like simple model. They are more or less like linear models, Bayesian models. Also KNN is it's a useful clustering method, but it has its own limitations. So the information that is being represented is relatively simple, such as the wind direction and yeah okay yeah the cricket neurons that represent the wind direction, then it's relatively easy. But um wait, skipping too forward. Yeah, so what they say is that we probably also need like more like sort of like non-linear models to understand a little bit more the complexity of like yeah more complex neural networks. So they move on and they speak about this data-driven machine learning approach. Again, so they put forward that this idea that the brain is basically doing encoding and decoding at the same time in a flexible way. Um, but they mentioned this example of how possibly produce some decoding approach, but then they discuss data-driven machine learning approaches, which, yeah, I don't know how it fits exactly with the rest of the paper, because they speak again. Okay, we can distinguish about fully observed models to generate these decoders, such as general linear models and latent variable models, which I don't know, to me sounds like the distinction between supervised and unsupervised learning. Because, yeah, for fully observed models, they provide examples such as the general linear model, and for latent variable models, they um, basically provide examples such as, PCA, ECA, or various techniques that allow to do basically dimensionality reduction, um, no matter the complexity of the model. So yeah, they also mention, of course, their own model, the Zebra model, which is supposed to be more flexible. Where is that? Yeah, we're using, even a data-driven approach or a more exploratory approach. Um, what they put forward, however, is that okay, all these models are quite cool. They allow to do statistical modeling of the like brain activity, but what they say is that they are not necessarily mechanistic models of the brain, so they do not necessarily respect the biophysical constraints of the model. Again, this point is not super clear. What they say is that by a mechanistic model, we win something like the Hodgkin-Huxley model, which is the model that was developed in the 50s to describe the activity of the like how the current flow through the membrane of the neurons. And they provide this figure which is based on, I guess, just their like it's not particularly based on data. I think it's just their opinion where they put forward a few models. They classify them as having statistical power against mechanistic realism, but they don't mention too much how they do it. Yeah, we provide a non-exhaustive selection of contributions, but yeah. Um, Anyway, they put forward this idea that most of the models are mostly statistical models of neural activity, but not necessarily constrained, but some mechanistic knowledge about how the neurons work, how the brain works, and so on. So what they do then is like moving forward in this paragraph where they speak about normative task-driven machine learning. They try, if I understand it correctly, to frame a little bit this problem. Because they say, okay, data-driven approaches, they tend to focus on finding patterns in neural data that are not necessarily constrained by any biophysical factor. So it might be how the brain actually works, but maybe it may also be not. But task-driven models aim to explain why neural representations emerge in the first place and from which structure they emerge. So they mentioned, for example, this efficient coding hypothesis that was put forward quite some time ago, which states that brain, for example, minimizes the use of energy while maximizing information transfer. So this will be, for example, a sort of like biophysical constraints. So you should try to build like a model that is trying to minimize the resources used, but also maximizing um, the transfer of information. And what they say is like, okay, we should try, for example, to train artificial neural networks on real-world tasks such as object recognition and try to actually constrain them by what we know about the brain. And they mentioned, a bunch of examples. And they say, okay, this task-driven modeling should offer us insights into what are the actual like underlying computational principles of neural circuits, and they could complement purely data-driven methods. And they gone providing a bunch of examples on visual, the paragraph is sort of visual feature decoding. It's mostly providing some example about like research done in the visual field on how Some research has been able to, for example, decode like images from, say, the visual cortex with different kind of yeah, like a we have research both in like animal and in humans. They also provide an example on decoding the motor cortex, or how some models have been able to implement some constraints to sort of uh, um, build brain-computer interfaces that allow, say, paralyzed um, individuals to control, say, a computer, or basically use the neural information to, yeah, produce that sort of like behavioral outcome that is mediated by the computer. And they provide some examples on,
Eduardo,
yeah.
sorry, is this the last one? Because we need some time for questions. I hate to
Yeah, I'm trying to skip forward a little bit. This is the last example they give is language decoding, which is not really about language, it's mostly about speech uh, production. So in my mind, it's still more about like okay, decoding like motor related information and produce some outcome. And yeah, toward the end, they try to pull things a little bit together. So okay, we should go toward causal models, even if I couldn't understand what exactly they meant by causal model. Um, so yeah, I think the main take is for them, like the models we have today, they basically describe this statistical um say relationship between brain activity and behavior, or the other way around. But not they do not necessarily describe the mechanistic principles that underlie this activity. So they say, okay, we could probably build some, physics-informed neural networks or dynamic system modeling to try to generate more interpretable and general models of the brain. Yeah, I don't know. Sorry if the presentation was a little bit confused, but that's also what I felt when I was reading that paper. So happy to take questions and maybe clarify also to myself.
Yeah, thank you, Eduardo, for presenting. Sorry again that I interrupted. I was just
No, no
that
worries.
you
Yeah.
will go for each example more detailed, which maybe we can expose it during the discussion. And Chris, I think, was the first one who raised the hand, so go.
Thank you. Yeah, a very interesting paper. Although, I mean, we have to start with simple models, but it doesn't seem to take into account that the brain is massively multimodal. So even when we process visual information, it's feeding in a lot of different systems. It's not only processing the visual input, it's also putting semantic on the input. It's also guessing a lot of things about what we see. It's not only feeding into one system. So if we are just using an encoding decoding model, I mean, the vast majority of the encoding decoding models that we are making in machine learning, they are for one modality, and they output one modality as well. So um, how does that? How good of a parallel is it with how the brain is functioning? And the second thing is, what if instead of simply encoding decoding, if we have an internal representation and so the brain, I think it's Friston who's uh, promoting this kind of a model
Yeah.
where we would be trying to the brain is trying to predict everything that's happening, and it's reacting to the changes brought by the input.
Yeah.
So this model of encoding decoding wouldn't work in that if that model was true.
Yeah, good old Freestone. Yeah, so I'll try to reply to that. So as I mentioned at first, it's not super clear the way they use encoding and decoding as terms in the first place. because yeah, we usually use them for describing models that are trying either to predict the neural signal or the other way around, predicting the stimuli from the neural signal. But here, the way they use it, and this is also the representation they give in figure one. But the way they use it here is also like kind of speaking like a sort of like lower level decoding. So how the information gets into the brain is the encoding. And then the decoding is more or less like the information gets out of the brain. And yeah, there is also stuff in between. They don't mention explicitly the multimodality. My take would be that given the models such as Zebra or a nonlinear ICA stuff in this like kind of like research field that have been developed in the past few years, is that you could technically do that by using the appropriate auxiliary variables, maybe, right? So this is also the trick that these models use to make the problem more defined and solve the, say, nonlinear ICA. So maybe the multimodality could be implemented by, yeah, say, using a couple of modalities at the same time, even
I mean, yeah,
more.
it could
Yeah.
probably be implemented, but
Yeah, they don't mention
they
it
don't.
explicitly in
Yeah.
the paper,
Okay.
so this would be my guess, educated guess. Yeah.
Thanks.
And don't know, was
Yeah,
Lilith or Anna?
yeah, well, I raised, but Anna, you can go first.
Thank you. Hi. Thanks for the presentation. I was wondering, so they give examples of like language decoding, motor decoding, and so on, and they use the same models for each of those, like those domains, basically, right? Did I understand
What do you
correctly?
mean?
So they try to make examples on like visual decoding, language
Hmm.
decoding, and so on by using exactly the same methods and then seeing, right?
It's they don't provide like examples they did themselves.
Okay.
Beside the zebra, it's more like yeah, reporting examples from the literature. So there is like the motor population, like they report like experiments from monkeys or non-human primates with the motor population vectors. Like you can decode the movement of say like the reach of an arm based on the neurons that are active.
Okay.
They
Did you
provide
also
a
compare? Did I also compare like which of those domains are basically the best, well, decoded by the methods that we currently have?
no, not really. There is
Okay,
no
would be
quantitative.
interesting to see because like we have, I my guess would be like visual decoding has been there for way longer than I guess. Well, I don't know. Maybe Steph knows better than like language decoding or speech decoding, but like visual stuff was there, from the very beginning on like the
Yeah, I
one
agree. And this
90s.
is also, yeah, this is also a little bit of weird. I mean, it's not weird, but they are providing an example of stuff that we know it works. A little bit as there is a lot also the motor cortex, the visual cortex. It's like, okay, the speech part is already like a bit more impressive, of course, being able to decode speech from an intact motor cortex, say after brainstem damage. It's still quite impressive. But yeah, I mean, there is a whole entire bunch of stuff that is, yeah, God knows how we can decode that. Um, and yeah, so yeah, the title of the paragraph about language decoding is, yeah, it's not language decoding if you think
Okay.
language as a faculty of language, it's speech decoding, more like
Production.
in this
Okay.
figure here. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I see. They have this one graph that you also showed where there's this like statistical power versus mechanistic realism and like the data-driven decoding
Yeah.
thing. What are they exactly comparing here? Like they're comparing obviously models, but what is
Yeah, again, as I mentioned, there is not much information on how they build this picture. They say, yeah, we provide a non-exhaustive selection of contributions, and they basically plot them again, like based on their take. There
okay?
is no quantitative comparing of these models.
And then the causal models are somehow
They should be in the
perfect.
middle, I guess, like on the diagonal. But then you have the Hodgkin and Huxley model, which is, well, it's mechanistic. It's also quite powerful. So I don't know. Yeah.
Okay,
Um,
thank
yeah.
you.
They place their own models as well somewhere in the space.
Do they? That was
Yes, Zebra
oh,
model,
there
which
it
is
is.
apparently
Yeah.
high statistical powers and a little bit mechanistic realism.
Yeah,
But again, it's not even clear exactly what is like this
like
mechanistic
measured.
realism, for example. And statistical powers maybe is a little bit easier to grasp. But yeah, how do you measure
And
like
also on which
mechanism?
kind of data? Like what is it? What is decoded?
It's spanning pretty much anything, right? So you have like the Zebra model was designed for, say, neural recordings, probably like recording from cells, but you could potentially use it also for like EEG data or stuff like that.
Okay.
Then you have the Hodgkin-Huxley model, which is designed to, yeah, measure and predict the currents of ions across the membrane. So there's quite a lot of variability. These models are about a lot of things. The one thing that they have in common is that it's about the brain somehow. And I couldn't recognize all of them either for the same reason because yeah, they go across like all the possible spans of like what is neuroscience, right? So like from some cells to brains. So it's supposed to be a really general paper, but at the same time, it's maybe a little bit too general.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Hope that answer.
And then I have my question also kind of connected with what you've discussed is yeah, about this plot. Yeah, first of all, you mentioned already the I don't know how it was created, but also could you explain what actually why would they differentiate between mechanistic realism and causal models? Do they explain why they are separating it? Because if it's
No,
mechanistic, so
oh,
you know
you
that
mean
it's
between
casual, right? Or
these two axes in the figure, statistical power and mechanistic realism?
yeah, like why Hodgkin's model, for example,
Mm-hmm.
is not on the casual models line.
I think mechanistic and casual should be the same thing. They do distinguish between mechanistic models and statistical models in the sense that a statistical model is not necessarily a model of causes, right?
But
If you
also,
find
but
a
sorry,
relationship, yeah.
but also like statistical model. Um, I mean, you can have a t-test, I don't know, and like this, you have an experiment, and with the statistical tools like t-test, you can infer causal, I don't know, relationship in
I
real world.
mean,
So I would differentiate more like predictive models, like machine learning. They are not causal. I don't know, and then the
yeah. So the point
classical
is that
traditional and
yeah, it's more or less
yeah.
in that line. But the point is that a statistical model can predict stuff, but it doesn't necessarily has to rely on the knowledge about the causes, right? If you find a variable that is predictive of another variable, that doesn't imply
Yeah,
causality. But
exactly.
the
That's what
model is still
predictive.
working, right? You're able to predict
Yeah, but that's not
things.
necessarily means that it is casual.
Yeah, that's the problem that I try to highlight. So we have a lot of statistical models, and I guess the fact that most of the models are on this lower diagonal should be kind of, yeah, proving
Okay.
that point.
Okay.
Like in saying, okay, we have a lot of statistical models, but not many mechanistic models. So our models somehow work. We can predict some stuff about the brain, but we don't know why we are predicting the stuff. And we
Mm.
should be knowing that if we really want to understand what is the basic computations that brain is carrying out. So their take at the end is like we will hope that we will have something that is comparable to the basic laws of physics, where we don't need to measure stuff, we don't need to predict stuff at any point every time because we have the laws, or we can just like we know how things are gonna happen because they are defined by mathematical principles.
Hmm.
Um,
And
so yeah, I hope that I don't know if that answers your question.
yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And the last quick question. So basically, this idea of decoding and encoding in this paper is more about finding those neurons that decode certain type of information, like grandma neuron, I don't know, Jennifer Aniston neuron, and all these things.
Yeah, I don't know because
Yeah,
they
or
focus a lot on this brain computer interface, especially in the second half of the paper, where we say, okay, if we want to build like proper interfaces, we need a good decoding model.
Mhm.
Sure. Uh, but I mean, you also probably have to understand how the information gets in the first place.
Mm.
Um,
Okay.
so yeah, I would have appreciated a little bit more clarity on like the definition also of decoding and encoding.
Yeah.
because they use it in a little bit different way of what it is used like most commonly in the literature.
Mm.
So yeah, it's hard to track like sometimes where they're using it in a certain way or in another. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Eduardo, for presenting this paper. I think it's time, and thank you everybody for engaging in discussion. And yeah, see you next week, 9:30, for another exciting paper in Neuroccino. Bye bye, everybody.